Great. Thank you, Alex. Thanks, everyone. Enjoyed, looking forward to spending the time with you today. As Alex said, some of the material that we'll be talking about today may be familiar, especially to those who have participated in some of our online courses or some of our webinars. But really, the idea is to be able to show the application of many different things that are happening in our environments through this very different lens of regeneration. And so my hope is it will reground you in some of that work, and if it's new, it's of course great. We're excited to know that you would be experiencing or seeing something from a different perspective, and if it's old hat, then it's just an opportunity for you to be able to hear it again as a way to reinforce future design. So with that in mind, I do want to do some call outs specifically to the team. You know, this is In Rhythm in particular is more than just obviously me. Several people from Jen to Alex that you just met, to Jeff and others who have continued to pour themselves, their lives and their souls into the work that we're doing. And it's quite exciting. So I am excited to be a part of that team and feel honored to be leading in that way. Just a few expectations. We're going to really talk about what crisis is and understanding and defining what the conditions of a crisis are. We're going to look at the problem and then identify why it is what it is. Look at some alternatives, look at our principles and framework as a means to look at regeneration as a platform for this kind of redesign, and then just allow for discussion. Webinars are tight timeframes, so you may have some comments along the way, and if you do, please throw them into the chat field, and Alex or others will flag me down, raise their hands and say, Trey, can we stop and take that question? So that will be probably the best way. I'll have some breaks along the way just to make sure there aren't any questions that we need to address. So with that in mind, let's just start with the question, what is a crisis? And I don't want to overcomplicate it because I think a crisis is existential. It's a personal thing. And what I mean by personal, meaning what's a crisis to me may not be a crisis to somebody else. And that's the same thing that it is within an organization. And when you think about it beyond an organization, it's the same thing within a system. And there are lots of different cycles that are happening within a crisis that give us completely different views of how that's both experienced as well as how we manage through it. But just at its core, it really is just intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. And we perceive it as that because that's why we're calling it a crisis. We may even see trauma in that same category. So when we think about what are some modern day examples of crisis, obviously we're here today because of some things that really are challenging our societies. But it's not just that. I mean, when we think about natural crisis, we think about weather events, from hurricanes to devastating fires. One of the projects that we have that we're lucky to be a part of is supporting the regeneration of Paradise, California, where there was a major fire. So we've had the opportunity to be a part of that kind of regenerative effort, but it was quite devastating and truly through the eyes of a lot of people, survivors of crisis. Tornadoes that you see through the Midwest, recognizing that we've got other disasters globally from volcanoes and whatnot, and then of course the COVID crisis. It has brought a lot of insight into some of the current design challenge in our system, and what is getting in the way for us to experience the potential of what our communities, our experts, our members represent. And so we're going to talk through what that is a little bit today. But we also recognize that crisis isn't just natural, it's also organizational. We see it in multiple different forms. You can see it in the media. It's pretty substantially it hits you between the eyes when you think about it from a media standpoint. All the different things that start to show up, and just to show a couple of different brands. I mean, just recently in the news this year, I can't imagine being an executive at Boeing right now. I mean, for all the different crises they're engaged in now and what's happened. And that also in the food and ag space, Chipotle, huge hit to their stock, to their top line revenues and profits, and people as a result of not being able to manage the E. coli scare as a part of there. And then knowing that recently you've got something as a high flying young company like Uber that can't get clear on how it's going to design and manage its culture, its environment. And to know that even Amazon, one of the biggest, if not seems to be one of the wealthiest owners in the world, is now getting a lot of criticism about how it treats its employees and staff, especially in the middle of what was a natural crisis that was happening as a part of the health scare. And that's not all. I mean, even here, a perfect example of this BP slide is, this is what happens in a crisis. There will be people who will take logos and superimpose on it what and how crisis impacts. So crisis is not limited to the silo or to the area that it happened. It actually impacts all aspects of the organization or a community or a project. But what we know is that an oil spill wasn't just hitting BP from a financial standpoint. It hit it from an environmental and a social, and recognizing that all of these are crises that we have to recognize and understand. And the hope is that maybe we can see it from a different lens. It doesn't have to be the way we've always seen it. And so just a couple of stats, PwC, so PricewaterhouseCoopers, put out a study in 2019, which was a really extensive study, by the way. If you have a chance or we need to send it to you, it'd be great for you to look at. They interviewed over 2,000 executives from 25 industries, 43 countries, and actually identified that subgroup experienced over 4,500 crises that were being analyzed and looked at. And what they realized is that 69% of all these major executives experienced a crisis in the last 5 years. And this is what was super interesting to me, 53% self-identified it as operational crises, which when you think about crisis, that's usually not the thing that we think about when we think about a crisis. We think about something that was outside of our control, and operational crises tend to be things that are within our control. The other thing was 29% of these surveyed said that there was no crisis preparedness. So there was no plans, there was no conversations. They just reacted when the crisis happened. And then an interesting stat that I'll bring up later, 74% enlisted outside support to design and to provide insight into how to manage through a crisis. So what was interesting is when you think about some of the stats that came out of this study, one in particular was, it was a financial liquidity crisis, which again, to me, is an interesting angle that was coming through this study. But if you look down to the right-hand side, I really want to show the categories. When you take all of them and you associate all these different self-identified crises, you'll see that roughly the ones that are operational in nature, what we showed on the last slide, represents about 53% of them. But then there was this technology roll-up crisis, 33%, which, by the way, I've been an operator my entire career, and in lots of different organizations, tech companies, manufacturing companies, global consulting and NGOs, and I see technology as operational. So just think about that for a moment, that self-identified, we're talking about 86% of what is self-identified crises are operational crises. And then when you get into other things like a market displacement or disruption, or cyber crimes, or legal issues, supply chain issues, even in my mind, show up in an operational or context. So these are really interesting triggers that required a very different response internally, or at least an associated belief that there should be a different response. So when we think about all these kinds of problems that we're managing throughout the crisis, what I'd like to do is spend some time just identifying what kind of problems we're talking about. So I'm going to just ask a series of questions. You can give me a chat feature. You can type in the chat, or you can unmute if you'd like, or you can just give me a thumbs up or thumbs down, right? So here's the first one. We're going to talk about types of problems, and we're going to associate that with the crises that we've just talked about. And the first one is this. It's a simple problem, baking a cake, right? So in baking a cake, you've got ingredients lists, recipes, series of known steps. You're pretty clear on what the assumptions are and the effects, and you believe they're manageable. And you're pretty confident you're going to get repeatable results. So my question to you right now is the crises we're talking about addressing simple problems? Just shake your head. Yes or no? No, they're not, right? So it's not a simple problem. All right, so let's go to the next problem. What about a complicated one, like sending a rocket into outer space or to the moon? So you still have known inputs. There are some blueprints. They're a little more detailed, probably a few extra variables. There still is a series of known steps. You can understand the assumptions and you're going to manage around them. The effects are something that you think could be designed around. And then again, you've got repeatable results. So question again. So when we think about crises, and the ones that we've talked about before, are they complicated problems? Still kind of a series of, if we just do it this way, we'll get repeatable outcomes. I don't know, it's kind of a mix, right? Could be there are some crises that we're in that really follow this, and maybe the rest are not. So let's go to the third type of problem, which is what we call a complex problem. When we think about nature, those slides I showed earlier, or markets or economies or society, the inputs are interdependent and they come from very different places. A lot of diversity. Each situation is different. Steps on what we need to do next is unknown because we're not sure where the beginning is to that. And that the assumptions are hard to get your head around. Actually, the idea that we can find a root cause in a complex system is absurd. There are no root causes in singularity, right? And then you've got unpredictable outcomes. It's like, well, I didn't expect that to happen. So then my question to you is when you think about crisis, are we talking about these kinds of problems? Yes, this is the kind of problems we're talking about. Problems that are not necessarily solved by taking this, what we saw as a complicated approach. But we're going to keep working through this because what I want us to do is to see the contrast between the three. Because a crisis really is important for us to understand what we're trying to solve. Because if we're not clear on what it is and the underlying assumptions of what it is that we're trying to solve, the method by which we solve it could actually create unintended consequences. And so this is actually, I think, paramount to how we would design and address crises as a part of a design or management process. We are not talking about simple problems. I don't think we're even talking about complicated problems. I think we're talking about complexity. And one of the things that I'm not going to have time to go in today, but is in a lot of really good research out there, is this idea of complexity bringing out wicked problems, and not wicked in the sense of moral, but wicked in the sense of so hard to solve. So when we've got crisis in the category of complexity and wicked problems in the idea of hard to solve, it begs the question of, are our current ways of addressing crisis even closely adequate to addressing crisis and complexity? And my answer to that question is absolutely not. We're not even close as a part of our current design process. The things that we can really lean on the left, the simple and the complicated, really are around things we make. And we've done a phenomenal job for generations, for centuries, on making things. But when we think about complexity, it's about things we manage, and the markets and the economies and organizations and society. And we've made very little progress when it comes to any of that. And I think it is the mismatch that is part of the biggest challenge for all of us. So when we think about what has informed our current crisis management design and response, it's absolutely this. When you look at, I would just challenge you after you finish this webinar to go just go Google crisis management. And I promise you will not be able to go from one listing to the next without seeing, if you just do these few things, that's how you manage a crisis, right? It's just a formula. It's just a series of recipes. And if you just do it, everything will work itself out. And what you don't want to do is pay a consultant to come in and tell you, here are the 5 ways that you manage a crisis. It is different. It is complex. And it isn't a series of instructions or recipes. But it is extremely important to be managed. So when we think about complexity, I want us to just think about this. Can you predict the occurrence of the next crisis? I mean, just think about that. I mean, this is where the idea of a complicated problem and solution isn't appropriate. Can you predict it? What about, will the next crisis be similar to this one? Do you know what it's going to look like? Is it going to be an operational one, a technology one? Is it going to be a social one? Is it going to be a market one? Can you have a detailed step-by-step plan documenting in advance of the crisis? And can you predict the outcome? Do you know exactly how this is all going to work itself out if you just follow these steps? I've been a little facetious when I'm saying this. There are some pretty amazing things starting to come out that are saying that we cannot take our old approach and apply it to complex challenges. And you have all experienced, we've all watched it from a media standpoint, and I know the media is not the best place for us to judge what's actually happening. But I will tell you that it is clear that most of our governments do not know how to manage through the crises that we're in the middle of. And it's not just that there isn't smart people, intelligent people with good intentions. It's just we're using a paradigm to address complexity in a way that will not provide us any comfort and address the things that we're talking about. So when we think about this, what are the consequences of taking a complicated approach to a complex problem? Because I think it is important for us to call out. What is the problem here? Here we got the U.S. employment engagement trend. It's gone up, 26% to 35% engagement rate within organizations over a period of 20 years, let's call it. But really, what's the issue? What's the problem we're trying to solve? Why would Gallup even put the poll out? Part of the challenge for all of us is recognizing that we tend to be addressing a lot of symptoms as a part of a process versus understanding the underlying conditions that would create this kind of outcome. It's not about employee engagement as a trend. It's about what does it say about the condition of our organizations or our societies that the majority of people who are there are not really wanting to be there. And what does that say about other things, not just the organizations? I mean, we know even Gallup was saying, you know, $500 billion a year in lost productivity. It really does have an impact. But how do you solve that? What does that look like? And then to know it doesn't end there. When people are disengaged in the workplace, it impacts their health, right? So economic insecurities, you know, the health that we experience globally. I mean, 3+ billion people who see themselves in a distressed place, that they're unhappy, stressed, and even unsafe at work. And here's, this is an older study, but here's a more recent one. 58% of Americans say work is a significant source of stress. I don't know about you, but when you're in the middle of crisis and you're stressed, do you think you're the best decision maker? I don't think we are. But yet we've created conditions where people are already maxed out, and yet we expect them to behave in a certain way when the organization itself is facing crisis. And to know that workload and people issues at the highest point of that in terms of stressors, and that the overall cost and then generational expense that's coming up means we've got a whole, I actually think the millennial generation that is seeing more depression and more anxiety at work is because of previous generations. And it is just manifesting itself in this current time. That when you grow up in a household where your mom and dad were stressed, or your the partners were stressed, or caretakers were stressed, you can imagine that you want that environment to be different. You don't want to relive that. Now imagine what it looks like for someone who steps into that and wants that from the get-go to be different than what it is. All of those kinds of environments, I think, create the conditions for us to manage crisis in a very, very dysfunctional and degenerative way. And this slide here, which comes from that same study, also recognizes you can't limit where that crisis is. So this is really interesting because this is data saying that this is the ancillary impact of a crisis. So it may have started operationally and then it ended up in marketplace disruption. And so you can't control it. And COVID's a perfect example of it. For anybody to think that we can, that our national boundaries could be truly walls to stop something from coming in, right? When it's permeable. There are ways things just pass. And what is it that we need to do in recognizing that kind of environment? And then just to continue to call out that I actually think the result of a lot of our current design results in a degenerative state for the entire planet. And we don't have time to talk about it today, but I would be remiss not to say that we're all experiencing increased stress because the planet is stressed. And we can't continue to allow that design to continue. Einstein has said this in a famous quote, when you think about the number of factors coming into a phenomenological complex is too large, when that's too large, too many factors, he's clearly saying the scientific method fails. We cannot solve this using that complicated approach. And I actually think when we think about this, we realize that, sometimes it's a language issue or semantics. But when we think about, is that complicated or complex? I mean, no, it's totally complicated. This is just, there are things we need, sets of instructions to get things done. But when we think about this, it's all about complexity. And in our inability to recognize the difference, puts us in a unique position to fail. And when I say fail, I mean fail our environments, fail our relationships, and fail the organizations we're a part of, because we're forcing living systems into a mechanistic system. So we see this as a design issue, and we've talked a little bit about it. It is an issue of complicated versus complex, and actually we'll go further to say it's an issue of mechanistic versus living. We have really taken a very strong mechanistic, complicated approach to how we are managing living systems. And by the way, all complex systems are living. And so when you think about that, it says, gosh, we definitely have to take, and crisis is a perfect example of it, a different approach. So we are not machines. Our states are not economic engines, right? We use this language and we've reinforced that kind of behavior for centuries, but it is not about working like a machine. But what we need to recognize is that the complicated systems and how we measure them has influenced how we design all the social systems that we're a part of. We measure, all complicated systems are measured on productivity and efficiency, every single one of them. And you would want it to be, a machine needs to produce, right? And you want it to produce in an efficient way. But when you think about living systems, the way we use our metrics, performance per employee, that's a productivity metric. I mean, is that how we're going to measure our teams and the decisions that are made? How about efficiency, retention per employee? Hey, the longer I keep somebody, the better it is on our cost structures, right? Expense per employee, how do we get people to not spend very much money? Or profit per employee, how do we find ways to produce more with less, right? Those are all complicated measures. And we are not a part of a complicated system. We are part of a complex one. So is that the best measure? Absolutely not. It's not. And we need to take it to that next step. So when we think about this mechanistic design, I just want you to think about it through the lens of crisis. We engineer a best practice approach. That is what you find in most of our recommendations and consulting, is that, listen, just follow these steps and we will find a way to support you getting through that crisis, right? It reinforces that there is one way to do this. So prescriptions, if by golly PwC tells you to do it, then it should be right. If BP did it, you should do it, right? But when you look at all those big organizations, they're not at all immune to this crisis. Their crises, actually the research says their crises are bigger. So what is it about prescriptions and best practices that's getting in our way to recognize that what we're doing is creating a whole culture of unintended consequences? Whole culture of it. Because we're forcing everything to behave in a way that it was never designed to behave. So the mechanistic approach does not work for complex problems, especially a crisis. We've got to take a different approach. And so we see this shift happening. And this shift is not, moving into a millennial age or a digital age or, God forbid, a Facebook age, but we're moving into the age of complexity, recognizing that we've got wicked problems, crises that we need to begin to address, and it's going to take a completely different paradigm. But we're not the only ones thinking this. Healthcare systems are beginning to design around this. It's complex adaptive systems. Schools are thinking about this. It is the way for us to address how we're going to position a response, a regenerative response to the current crisis or future crises that we have. So we want to use life as that metaphor. Now, I won't have time. If you want to watch something, I encourage you to go watch one of the webinars that Jeff Sue's done, our partner, on living systems and our deep connection to how we inform the work that we do. So I'm going to cover a couple of things here, but I'm not going to do it justice. But what we believe is there is a way for us to use and see living systems as a way to inform crisis management. And we really take a lot of work out of the Santiago School, which was one of the first schools early or mid or late in the 20th century to take a holistic or systems approach to looking at life. And what they did is they took they examined and looked at all of the material energetic pathways of a simple cell, bacteria, and they recreated it in the test tube to see if they could recognize what about it could tell them and give them insights into what is life. And one of the things that came out of that the defining aspect of life was two things: self-maintenance and self-regeneration. So they actually coined this term autopoiesis, self-poetry and self-making. Now, when you just think about those few things right there, and in the context of a crisis, and recognizing that life is dynamic and that it's changing and evolving, and that's what complex systems are all about. When we change and reframe ourselves that this is all about what can we do to get in rhythm with what that is versus fight its natural design, I think is key to how we solve these things. So they then made the point that life is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. And we won't have time to go deeply into this idea that living is regenerative and regenerative is living. We see those as equal with one another. But what we recognize is because of this deep understanding of life, it can inform a really intentional, beautiful design for how we manage through crisis and current systems. So they then identified these 4 unique properties. And this also came through Capra's work, which is an incredible system scientist that has really influenced a lot of the regenerative thinking that's happening today. And a couple of the unique propositions that he recognizes: one is self-regeneration is not located in any one place. It is dependent upon all its interconnected relationships, and that life was holistic or emergent from all those connected relationships, and that all of the different aspects of that cell were autopoietic or self-regenerating systems. That describes an organization or nature to a T. I mean, this is what we're addressing. And so when we think about the human body, for instance, on the left side, that is life. It's in interconnected relationships. On the right, it's death. They are separated. The body cannot survive when it is not within the boundary of that making, right? And so the natural environment, same thing. We really see an ecosystem, and there's some debates on it, an ecosystem as an autopoietic system. And Gaia theory would probably be the best example of that, where we know within that interconnected relationship, there is something emergent that is above and beyond all this, that is actually attuned in all of life. But when you disconnect it, like what industrialized agriculture does, you actually reduce the life of that system. And business and organization. So when you think about crisis on the left looks very different than crisis on the right. But how many times have we seen where one hand isn't actually at all talking to the other? All we have to do is look at our government. We've got a president saying one thing. We've got a House of Representatives saying something else. We've got Senate saying something else. And the inability to be in concert, working together to be able to create life is tough, right? It really feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And communities are the same. When we're in cross-sector conversations or work with one another. So now what does this application look like to crisis? Well, let's just think about it. Self-regenerative ability is not located in any one place. complex problems and crises cannot be managed in one department under a single plan. So don't buy into the idea that consultant comes along and hires you the game plan and says, just follow these steps and you'll be able to manage crisis. No, it doesn't work that way. There is no single plan that is going to be able to manage crisis. Just dependent on interconnected relationships in all parts of the cell. Realize that organizational life is dependent upon the decisions and the behaviors between all departments, all members, all teams. And so when you're thinking about crisis, when you're thinking about organizational design, you're thinking about organizational approaches, you've got to recognize that all of that is key to be able to create the outcomes that we all want and to be able to be in lockstep with one another in that process. Life is a holistic emergent property. Real potential or life emerges when we nurture the connections across the organization, not separate them, not force them into productivity and efficiency measures, right? And then the last is that self-regenerative systems. We need to understand our departments, our clients, our suppliers are all living systems. And with energy to address complexity, just like we all want to be able to address the complexity that exists. So how do we do that? But if we begin to see ourselves as that ecosystem, it changes the framing and the dynamics pretty substantially versus the siloing and the expertise and the top-down approach. This allows us to take a very different engagement. So what we say is organizations are living systems capable of maintaining itself within the boundary of its own making. And I think this is core to how we manage crisis. Crisis can't be managed without this kind of approach. So that living systems design then informs what we call a principled approach. And when we think about principles, think about, if you were a designer, how principles can guide you, but not prescribe anything, because the principles help you to design what is culturally and locally and organizationally relevant. That facilitates this idea of frameworks, and not just any frameworks, but flexible frameworks, frameworks that can be utilized in stressful situations, in normal situations. All of that, we believe, create the conditions to regenerate health in a system. And we need health. For us to manage crisis, for us to manage organizations, health has to be at its core. So when we talk about what does it look like to create the conditions to manage crisis, it means creating the conditions for health. So when we think about the principles, won't spend time to go through them all, but what I want us to recognize is that each of these principles have an application in crisis management. Holism, that interrelatedness and interdependence, similar to what we just said, it's not the responsibility of one department to create the plan. The systems approach to addressing and adapting to a living environment is how we apply the principle of holism to crisis management. And that mutualism, inherent value and dependence on the other. So how do we design around that inherent value of all members to create the conditions for the most appropriate behaviors and responses across the entire organization? It's not about putting a plan on a shelf to say we've got it. Actually, the majority of organizations are not engaged. Think about that stat. 74% of organizations were looking for outside expertise, when inside the organization is your best solution to creating health. And then uniqueness. How do we design our crisis response, our organizational response, unique to our organization, our culture, our context, to engage people? Best practices will ensure limited success at best, and most likely the ultimate failure at worst. One of the stats I didn't say is how many organizations after a major crisis actually within 5 years go out of business. One stat says it's as high as 50%. Now, why is that the case? Why would 50% of the organizations go through a major crisis go out of business? I think it says something about how we're managing it. And then the last three is evolutionary, nodal, and developmental. And you can imagine evolutionary completely makes sense. How are we able to build capacity within an organization to adapt and to be agile and to be able to not fall into the idea of trying to predict, but creating conditions so we can respond appropriately? Wow, that kind of capacity we want in an organization. And to recognize, to do that, we need to redistribute power and decision-making and resources, because we actually increase the risk inherently by centralizing control and decision-making. You want to enhance crisis, put the control of all the decisions in the hands of a few versus decentralizing it. I have a friend who owns a consulting firm in Manhattan. All he does is risk mitigation work for Fortune 1000 companies. And the biggest thing they're trying to solve is resilience. How do we become more resilient? And everybody is looking for a silver bullet. What if the quote unquote silver bullet was investment and the development and the growth of your members? And that would be the last principle as a part of this. So when we see this, we lean heavily on the backs of great like Buckminster Fuller that said, work with life-centered principles and the universe pitches in to help. I think when we continue to work in conflict with and not in rhythm with, we find that the forces working against us is substantial. And then we're left to having to use energy to fight those forces versus get in rhythm with them. So in bringing it all together, that machine design really does degenerate the health of the system. And the living system design, we believe, regenerates the health of the system in crisis and in normal operating organizational conditions. But one requires a lot of energy to manage. And the other one, I think, allows for that self-regeneration and self-management to create energy within the system. And then we spend time continuing to support organizations in shifting from that machine paradigm to that living systems one as a way to approach organizational crisis. So when we think about this, these are the kind of frameworks that we use as a part of that process. And we see, you'll notice something that's very different about this. We see this as a design framework, a process framework, and a decision-making framework. And so think beyond the linear process view and how it's all interrelated and connected. But the thing to recognize here that's very different, that's true to complex living systems, and I think core to crisis, is that we have to create the conditions for health. And if we don't begin to reframe our conversations within crisis to what were the conditions to create this crisis, and that is important. When the majority of crises, 86% of the crises were operational crises, I think they all could be managed in a very, very different way. But that's going to require us to see that organization as a living system and that health is its measure, not productivity and efficiency. And it doesn't mean we can't measure productivity and efficiency, but with health as a measure, we completely take a very different approach. So here's just an example where we use it as a design framework. And imagine we've got an organizational purpose that we're clear on as an organization that's looking to make a real impact in, say, food and agriculture. But we're getting clear on what's the point of a crisis management. What's the purpose of crisis management, and how do we define what that is? And then began going through the process of defining what we believe health is when we're designing it as a part of a crisis management process. And that we would want to ask this question around energy flow in designing health. How do we design to increase the energy of all our members? Because we want people engaged, especially in a crisis, not disengaged. And when we think about informational cycles, these are decision-making cycles. And we think about, so how do we build capacity for relevant and intelligent decisions across the entire organization? That's really create capacity for response. And then how do we minimize communication silos and increase the exchange of information that cross the organizations? And then, God forbid, that we would involve our partners to inform this design process. So then when we think about structures, structures specifically are designed to enable the health of the system, not to just do the work of the system. So how do we design roles and responsibilities to increase energy, to allow for capacity to be built around decision-making, minimizing silos, and engaging our network of partners? And how do we put governance and policy in place that is actually adaptable and agile? And then recognizing that what we want in place is the ability to have a structure in place to monitor the health of the system. And to know that that is a more important indicator than productivity and efficiency, because that should be, this is something I talk about in other engagements, that should be just a natural recurring aspect of the system. So then when we do the design work is this, so how do we integrate this around departments? What technologies and tools can support us in that? How do we create conditions for development and training as a part of that process? What are different scenarios that we could potentially consider in this process? And what are the short-term outcomes and deliverables that we really do want to be paying attention to ensure that we are creating the conditions for health? That is what creates what we call emergent abundance or system resilience, where there's thriving members and that potential shows up that wouldn't show up in a mechanistic system. Because just a reminder, a mechanistic system is designed to do one thing only, produce and hopefully there's some efficiency from it. There isn't anything emergent. It does exactly what it was designed to do. So wouldn't we want a system to address wicked problems, crisis, that's not designed to just do one thing, that it's actually capable of being agile and to pivot and to reorganize and to address the crisis and address the potential that exists in our organizations as a way to truly create the impacts that we want. So that is what we see as a living systems design. So these are some of the shifts we talk about in some of that, and then we'll just kind of close it up here with the last few minutes. We're moving from these best practices to principles, from prescriptions to responsive frameworks, from dominance to interdependence, from prediction to pattern, and from this extraction mentality, which is deeply rooted in a mechanistic system, to equity. I just want to recognize that when we move to a decentralized empowerment, we actually increase the resilience of the system. So our working definition for regenerative organization, in crisis or not, is a living, evolving, naturally functioning organization where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. And we use that to guide us in conversations to know if it's living, if it's evolving, and it's naturally functioning, then we have the ability to adjust, to adapt, and to address crisis at any point in time. So Donella Meadows, famous system scientist, the one thing she says that I think is so powerful is that most of our challenges is the fact that we have, and she calls it this, our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from the mismatch of this complex system with this divisible, separable, infinite system that we're a part of. And so with that, I will thank you for the opportunity to share and open up for questions.